Once upon a time, fairy tales were much darker than we remember. We all grew up with the magical stories of Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty, tales filled with adventure, romance, and of course, a happy ending. But what if I told you that the original versions of these stories were far more sinister than their modern Disney adaptations? The brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm, weren't writing bedtime stories to make children feel safe. They were recording folklore filled with violence, revenge, and even horror. Did you know that in the original Cinderella, her stepsisters sliced off parts of their feet to fit into the glass slipper? Or that in Sleeping Beauty, she wasn't woken by true love's kiss, but by childbirth after being taken advantage of in her sleep? Even Snow White's evil queen wasn't just banished, she was forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dropped dead. In this video, we're diving into the dark origins of these classic fairy tales and exploring how our perspective on them changes as we grow older. Let's uncover the real stories behind the Brothers Grimm. Now, before we dive into the stories themselves, let's talk about the men behind them. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were German scholars, linguists, and folklorists. Born in the late 18th century, they were fascinated by language and the way stories traveled across generations. They weren't writing fairy tales from scratch, rather they were collecting old folk stories that had been passed down orally for centuries. Their goal was to preserve German culture through folklore. But as they recorded these stories, they also made choices, sometimes editing the tales to reflect the morals and values of the time, and sometimes leaving in the horrifying details that people today might find disturbing. The first edition of their book, Children's and Household Tales, was published in 1812. But despite the title, many of these stories were far from child-friendly. So now that we know who they were, let's take a look at some of their most famous tales and the darkness hidden within them. Let's start with one of the most famous fairy tales of all time, Cinderella. The Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, titled Aschenputtel, which translates to Ash Fool or Ash Girl, is far darker than the well-known Disney adaptation. While the overarching theme remains the same, a mistreated young girl finds happiness through transformation, the original tale is filled with brutal punishments, supernatural elements, and symbolic undertones that reflect societal values of the time. Unlike Disney's Cinderella, who is treated cruelly but remains patient and kind until she is magically rescued, Aschenputtel endures much harsher suffering. She is forced to sleep in the ashes, do the hardest household labor, and is relentlessly mocked by her stepsisters, reinforcing her position as an outcast. Without a fairy godmother, her only source of help is her dead mother's spirit, which manifests through a hazel tree she plants on her mother's grave. This focus on suffering serves as a moral lesson on endurance, resilience, and humility, mirroring real-world hardships and reinforcing the belief that patience and devotion lead to ultimate reward. A key difference in the Grimm version is the absence of a fairy godmother. Instead, Aschenputtel's transformation is deeply rooted in spiritual and supernatural elements. The hazel tree she nurtures with her tears becomes her source of strength, and a white bird symbolizing her mother's spirit provides her with fine dresses and golden shoes whenever she prays. This connection to nature and the dead reflects older pagan beliefs, where ancestors played a crucial role in guiding the living. Unlike modern versions that emphasize external magic, the Grimm tales suggest that true transformation comes from faith, devotion, and inner strength. The most shocking aspect of Aschenputtel is the gruesome fate of the stepsisters. In their desperation to fit into the golden slipper, one cuts off her toes, while the other slices off part of her heel. Both times, doves expose their deception by pointing out the blood in the shoe, and in the end, these same doves peck out their eyes as punishment, leaving them blind for life. This extreme justice reinforces a strict moral order, where cruelty and deception are met with severe consequences. Their self-mutilation also symbolizes the lengths people go to for status and power, ultimately leading to their own downfall, in contrast to Cinderella's patience and faith. Another fascinating difference is the symbolism of the golden slipper. While the glass slipper in modern adaptations represents delicacy and magic, gold in the Grimm version symbolizes purity, high value, and divine reward. Unlike glass, which is fragile, gold is precious and enduring, representing Cinderella's inner worth. This shift in symbolism emphasizes that her triumph is not about a fleeting magical transformation, but a well-earned reward for her virtue and perseverance. Interestingly, the prince in Aschenputtel plays a more passive role compared to modern interpretations. He does not actively search for Cinderella, but instead relies on the guidance of the doves to expose the stepsister's deception. Even after encountering Cinderella multiple times at the ball, he fails to recognize her, only realizing her true identity when fate, through the bird's intervention, reveals it. This suggests that his role is not that of a heroic romantic figure, but rather a tool of destiny, emphasizing that Cinderella's virtue and spiritual guidance, rather than romantic love, are what led her to happiness. The structure of the story also reinforces its deeper themes. Instead of attending a single ball, Cinderella goes to 3, each time appearing in increasingly beautiful gowns and deliberately avoiding capture. Unlike Disney's version where she runs away due to a magical time limit, in the Grimm tales, she deliberately hides in a pigeon coop and a tree before escaping on foot. This 3-night test aligns with traditional folkloric initiation rites, symbolizing patience, wisdom, and worthiness before receiving a reward. Ultimately, Aschenputtel is not just a rags-to-riches fairy tale, it is a moral and spiritual journey. It emphasizes endurance and faith in the face of suffering. The idea that evil is always punished and the belief that true rewards come not from material wealth, but from inner virtue. Unlike modern adaptations that focus on romance and transformation, the Grimm version teaches a much harsher lesson, that patience, humility, and perseverance are the true magic that leads to a happily ever after. Another classic that has been softened over time is Sleeping Beauty, or as the Grimm brothers titled it, Little Briar Rose, or Dornröschen. Much like Aschenputtel, Little Briar Rose is a tale not just about transformation, but about endurance, fate, and the inevitable passage of time. Now, at first glance, Little Briar Rose may seem like a simple fairy tale. A princess is cursed to sleep for 100 years, only to be awakened by a prince. However, the original Grimm version strips away much of the romance and instead leans heavily into the themes of destiny and patience. Unlike the Disney adaptation where Maleficent casts a spiteful curse, the Grimm tale presents the event as an unavoidable prophecy. When the king and queen celebrate their daughter's birth, they invite 12 wise women, or fairies, but because they only have 12 golden plates, they leave out the 13th. Outraged, this wise woman declares that the princess will prick her finger on a spindle and die. However, another wise woman softens the fate, altering it so that she will not die, but instead fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. The king, desperate to protect his daughter, orders all spinning wheels to be removed from the kingdom, but despite his efforts, fate takes its course. On her 15th birthday, the princess finds a hidden spindle, pricks her finger, and falls into her enchanted sleep, exactly as foretold. This emphasis on inevitability is key to understanding Little Briar Rose. Unlike Cinderella, where the protagonist actively endures suffering and earns her reward, Sleeping Beauty highlights the futility of trying to escape one's fate. No matter how much the king tries to prevent the prophecy, it still unfolds exactly as predicted. This idea that destiny cannot be avoided is a recurring theme in folklore and mythology. It teaches that some things in life must happen in their own time, no matter how much we try to change them. Time itself plays a powerful role in this story. When the princess falls asleep, so does the entire castle. Servants, animals, even the fire on the hearth, all frozen for a century. A thick, thorny hedge grows around the castle, deterring anyone who tries to enter. Many princes attempt to fight their way through before the appointed time, but they become trapped in the thorns and perish. When the 100 years have passed, however, the hedge transforms into roses, allowing the destined prince to pass unharmed. Unlike in modern versions where the prince actively rescues Sleeping Beauty, in the Grimm tale he simply arrives at the right moment and she awakens naturally as the prophecy comes to an end. This shift is important because it reinforces the idea that patience, not action, is the key to success. While Cinderella teaches the value of endurance and faith, Sleeping Beauty teaches that everything happens in its own time. Rushing fate only leads to destruction. Another striking difference is the prince's role. In Cinderella, the prince is a passive observer, relying on divine intervention to recognize his true bride. In Little Briar Rose, he is even less of a hero. He does not break the curse, nor does he actively fight for the princess. Instead, he is simply the instrument through which fate completes itself. His arrival is not an act of love, but a fulfillment of destiny. The romantic notion of true love's kiss is absent in the Grimm version. The princess wakes simply because the time has come for her to awaken. This makes the story less about romance and more about the natural cycles of life, transformation, and renewal. Symbolism plays a major role in Little Briar Rose, just as it does in Cinderella. The spindle represents the passage of time and the inescapability of fate. Pricking her finger marks the princess's transition from childhood to adulthood, much like a coming-of-age ritual. The enchanted sleep mirrors the cycles of nature, resembling winter before spring or death before rebirth. The thorny hedge surrounding the castle serves as both protection and isolation, ensuring that the princess remains undisturbed until the right time. It also serves as a warning. Those who try to claim something before its proper moment will only bring destruction upon themselves. Just as Cinderella's stepsisters mutilate their own feet in a desperate attempt to force destiny, the princes who attempt to reach Briar Rose too soon meet a violent end. Ultimately, Little Briar Rose and Aschenputtel are two sides of the same coin. Both deal with patience, suffering, and the passage of time, but in different ways. Aschenputtel must actively endure hardship, proving her worth through suffering and faith. Little Briar Rose, on the other hand, teaches a more passive lesson. Sometimes, waiting and allowing events to unfold naturally is the only path forward. While modern adaptations emphasize romance and magic, the Grimm versions remind us that fairy tales were originally cautionary tales, designed to teach patience, endurance, and the acceptance of fate. In both stories, the true magic is not in a prince's kiss or a fairy godmother's wand. It is in the unseen forces that guide the characters toward their destiny, whether through perseverance or simply the passage of time. If you thought the Grimm's Little Briar Rose had eerie themes of fate and inescapable destiny, Basile's version, titled Sun, Moon, and Talia, takes it to an even more sinister level, because in this version, Sleeping Beauty is not just put into an enchanted sleep, she is violated while unconscious. In Basile's tale, a king hears of a nobleman's daughter, Talia, who has fallen into a deep magical sleep due to a prophecy. Unlike in the later versions where a spindle pricks the princess's finger, here it is a splinter of flax that causes her to fall into a death-like slumber. Her devastated father places her in an abandoned palace and leaves her there. Sometime later, a wandering king, not a prince, finds her unconscious and instead of trying to wake her, takes advantage of her. Without ever regaining consciousness, Talia gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl named Sun and Moon. The babies, in search of food, suck on their mother's finger, accidentally dislodging the flax splinter. This awakens her, not through true love's kiss, but through the pain of childbirth and the instinct of motherhood. When the king, who is already married, returns to Talia, she is now awake and meets her children for the first time. Instead of realizing the horror of what he has done, the king professes his love for her. However, the situation turns even darker when the king's wife discovers the affair. In a fit of rage, the queen orders the children to be cooked and served to the king as a meal. However, the cook secretly saves them and tricks the queen into thinking she has eaten them. When the king learns of his wife's cruelty, he burns her alive and then marries Talia. Basile's version is not a love story. It is a cautionary tale about fate, power, and abuse, far removed from the whimsical romance of modern adaptations. Unlike in later versions where the prince is passive and guided by destiny, Basile's king acts with complete entitlement. He takes what he wants simply because he can, without consequences for his initial violation of Talia. While Grimm's Sleeping Beauty emphasizes patience and waiting for destiny to unfold, Basile's version suggests that fate does not always bring happiness. It can bring horror and injustice as well. Unlike in the later tales where romantic love breaks the spell, here it is Talia's children who bring her back to life, reinforcing the idea that the maternal bond is more powerful than any prince's kiss. Now, when you're talking about fairy tales, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs cannot be overlooked. The Disney version made us fall in love with the cheerful dwarfs, the evil queen, and, of course, the idea of true love's kiss. Long before Disney's Snow White graced the silver screen, there was another version of the tale, darker, sharper, and filled with the kind of grim details that only the brothers Grimm could weave. The story, first published in 1812, is still recognized to modern audiences. A beautiful princess, skin white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony, becomes the object of her stepmother's envy. The queen, a vain and wicked woman, consults her magic mirror daily, basking in its praise until one day it tells her the terrible truth. Snow White is now the fairest of them all. From here, the bones of the story remain familiar. An attempted assassination, an escape into the forest, and a home among seven dwarfs. But the Grimm version? It doesn't hold back. The evil queen, in her obsession, doesn't just try to kill Snow White once, she tries 3 times. First with a suffocating lace bodice, then with a poisoned comb, and finally with the infamous poisoned apple. Each time, Snow White falls victim to her deception until ultimately a piece of the apple becomes lodged in her throat, sending her into a death-like sleep. Now, in Disney's 1937 adaptation, the tale is softened, romanticized, and sprinkled with that signature golden glow. The dwarves are more playful, the queen's cruelty is streamlined into a single poisoned apple, and true love's kiss is introduced as the magical cure. But in the original, there's no kiss. Instead, Snow White is awakened when the prince's servants carrying her coffin stumble and the poisoned apple is dislodged from her throat. Hardly the sweeping romance we remember from childhood. And then there's the queen's fate. In Disney's version, she meets a dramatic yet relatively bloodless end, falling to her doom. But the Grimms? They had a taste for poetic justice. At Snow White's wedding, the wicked queen is forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance until she drops dead, a punishment that, to modern sensibilities, feels as brutal as the queen herself. Reading Snow White as an adult, the story shifts. The themes of vanity, envy, and innocence feel starker. The stepmother isn't just evil, she's a warning about obsession, about the dangers of power and beauty unchecked. Snow White, in turn, is more naive than the plucky heroine we remember, repeatedly falling for the queen's tricks in a way that seems almost frustrating. But perhaps that too is part of the message. Innocence can be its own danger in a world filled with wolves in disguise. So while Disney's Snow White is a dream draped in pastel hues and musical whimsy, the Grimm brothers' version remains something more raw, closer to a nightmare, but one with its own dark, cautionary magic. But why were these fairy tales so brutal? The answer lies in their purpose. Unlike today's bedtime stories, these were cautionary tales meant to warn children about the dangers of the world. They taught harsh lessons. Don't trust strangers, don't be vain, and don't expect mercy. Over time, these stories were softened to appeal to modern audiences, but their origins remind us of the raw fears and realities people faced centuries ago. Fairy tales aren't just childhood fantasies. They reveal the fears, morals, and harsh realities of the past. As kids, we focused on the magic. As adults, we see the horror. So the next time you hear Once Upon a Time, remember, happily ever after wasn't always guaranteed. Anyway, these were my thoughts on the past pages. Let me know what tales you'd like me to cover next, and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.